What if the person you judged the most turned out to be the one who deserved your deepest respect? Karen Whitmore thought she had the world figured out until one flight, one woman, and one moment of cruel ignorance shattered that illusion. She had no idea that the quiet soldier sitting beside her carried a story far greater than her assumptions. And by the time she realized the truth, it was too late to take back the damage. The airport was alive with motion, the hum of conversations, the rhythmic rolling of suitcases, the crisp voice of the announcer calling flights. Major Danielle Carter walked with quiet confidence, her military uniform perfectly pressed, her posture unshaken. 14 months overseas had sharpened her instincts, but today all she wanted was to get home. People noticed her. They always did. Some nodded in respect. Others glanced and looked away. She was used to it. Soldiers didn't serve for attention. The weight of her duffel bag pressed against her shoulder. Inside, carefully packed, was a small frame photo. Her family. Her heartbeat steadied. A few more hours and she'd see them again. The boarding area bustled with passengers. Business travelers typed furiously on laptops. Families corralled restless children. Flight attendants welcomed passengers. And then, Karen Whitmore, middle-aged, perfectly styled blonde hair, a designer purse resting in her lap, the air of someone who had never waited for anything. Danielle didn't notice her at first. She was focused on the flight ahead, one step closer to home. The gate agent called her Rao. She stepped forward, handed over her ticket. "Welcome aboard, Major Carter," the flight attendant said with a polite smile. Danielle nodded. No need for grand gestures, just simple acknowledgement. That was enough. She walked down the jet bridge, entered the cabin, and found her seat in premium economy, a rare luxury. Her unit had surprised her with the upgrade. She set her bag under the seat and let out a slow breath. Home was one flight away. Then, a scoff, soft but deliberate. Danielle turned slightly. "Karen." The woman pursed her lips, eyes narrowing. She muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "They'll let just anyone into the military these days." Danielle exhaled slowly. Not today. She had been trained for far worse. Instead of reacting, she reached into her bag and pulled out the photo of her family, a reminder of what truly mattered. The edges were worn from years of travel. Her parents, her younger sister, her baby nephew, who had only known her through video calls. She traced her fingers over the image. A few more hours and she'd hold them in her arms again. The final passengers boarded. The flight attendants secured the doors. The engines rumbled. The plane taxied onto the runway. Danielle leaned back in her seat, exhaustion weighing on her. She had survived war zones. A few hours in the air should have been easy. But then, Karen shifted in her seat, lips curling into a smirk. Danielle felt it. The storm hadn't even started yet. The plane had barely left the ground when the first insult came. Danielle sat still, eyes closed, exhaustion pressing on her, like a weighted blanket. Sleep never came easy after deployment. Too many memories, too much noise, even in silence. She felt a shift beside her, a scoff. Danielle opened her eyes just in time to see Karen Whitmore glaring at her. Karen's lips curled in disapproval. Her voice carried, sharp and deliberate. Taxpayers' money wasted on useless soldiers like her. Danielle's fingers tensed around the family photo, still resting in her lap. She took a slow breath. Not today, not worth it. A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. They heard it. They knew, but no one said a word. Karen smirked, emboldened by the silence. She leaned slightly toward the man beside her, whispering, but just loud enough for Danielle to hear. "Bet she's never even seen real combat. Probably just a desk job." Danielle's jaw tightened. Her eyes stayed on the seat back in front of her. She could ignore it. She could let it go. But the words landed differently. She remembered the sounds of gunfire, the burning wreckage of a convoy under attack, the screams of wounded soldiers as she fought to keep them alive. Her hand clenched. Then slowly, she exhaled, unclenching her fingers. Karen was nothing more than a mosquito, annoying, persistent, but ultimately insignificant. A young woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, stealing a glance at Danielle before turning to Karen. "Maybe you should stop assuming things," she said, voice measured but firm. Karen scoffed. "I have a right to my opinion." Danielle didn't react. She had seen this play out before. Karen wasn't looking for a conversation. She wanted a reaction, power, control. The flight attendant appeared at the edge of the row, polite but watchful. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, scanning between the passengers. Karen smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they think they're untouchable. "Oh, nothing. Just having a conversation," she said sweetly. The flight attendant's gaze lingered on Danielle, silently asking if she was okay. Danielle gave a small nod. The attendant hesitated, then moved on. She sensed the hostility, but wasn't sure how to intervene. Danielle turned her head, staring out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Peaceful, untouchable. That's where she wanted to be, somewhere above all of this. But she was trapped in a cabin at 30,000 feet, and Karen wasn't done yet. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky. The world below faded into nothing but clouds and distance. But inside the cabin, tension simmered. Danielle sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She had trained herself to ignore ignorance, to let words roll off her like rain on stone. But some people pushed limits. Karen wasn't done yet. She shifted in her seat, sighing loudly. Then just as before, she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Bet she only joined for the benefits. Danielle's grip on her family photo tightened. Her heartbeat didn't race. Her face didn't change. Years of discipline kept her steady. Karen, emboldened by Danielle's silence, leaned toward her seatmate again. Government handouts, she whispered. They get free everything. Housing, medical care, special treatment. And for what? Pretending to serve? Danielle inhaled slowly. One breath in, one breath out. A voice broke through. Maybe you should stop talking. It came from across the aisle. A young woman in her late 20s, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She had enough. Karen turned to her, brows raised. Excuse me? The woman didn't back down. You don't know anything about her, so maybe just don't. Karen scoffed, shaking her head. Oh, I see. I'm not even allowed to have an opinion anymore? A few passengers exchanged glances. The murmurs in the cabin grew. Danielle remained still. She had seen this before. It always played out the same way. Karen wasn't looking for a conversation. She wanted control, power, a reaction. The flight attendant approached again. This time her expression was firm. Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice, she said, looking directly at Karen. Karen gave an exaggerated smile, the kind people wear when they think they're untouchable. Oh, I was just having a conversation, she said sweetly. Didn't realize that was a crime now. The flight attendant didn't budge. Just be respectful of those around you. Karen rolled her eyes but leaned back, arms crossed. The attendant turned to Danielle, her voice softer. Is everything okay? Danielle nodded once. She wasn't going to make this bigger than it already was. The flight attendant hesitated, then walked away, glancing back as if reconsidering. Karen smirked. Didn't think soldiers needed people to defend them. Danielle finally turned to face her. Her expression was unreadable, her voice calm. People defend what's right, she said simply. Karen's smirk faltered. She looked away. For a brief moment, there was silence. But Karen wouldn't stay quiet for long. The hum of the engines filled the space between them. Then, another jab. You know, Karen said, tapping her manicured nails against the armrest, I bet she never even saw combat. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Danielle's jaw tightened. She had no intention of arguing, but the memories came anyway. Gunfire, the heat of the battlefield, the weight of a wounded soldier in her arms, the screams of men she couldn't save. Karen smirked again. Probably just sat at a desk somewhere, shuffling papers. Danielle exhaled. Karen had no idea who she was speaking to, but she was about to find out. The plane hummed softly, but inside the cabin, the tension crackled. Danielle remained still, staring at the seat in front of her. Her training taught her to choose her battles. This one wasn't worth it, but Karen Whitmore had no intention of letting it go. She tapped her nails against the tray table, smirking. She wanted a reaction. She wanted power. Women like her wouldn't last a second in a real war zone, she muttered. Danielle inhaled deeply, one breath in, one breath out. The battlefield flashed in her mind. The stench of blood, the weight of a fallen comrade, the distant sound of mortars landing too close. And Karen had the nerve to assume she'd never seen war. Across the aisle, a man in a Navy business suit turned around. He had been silent before, but now he was done watching. Ma'am, he said evenly, I think you should stop talking. Karen's head snapped toward him, eyebrows raised. Excuse me? The businessman sighed. It's simple. Stop. Talking. A few passengers exchanged glances. They agreed. They just hadn't spoken up. Karen scoffed and turned back to Danielle. Funny. Looks like you've got yourself a little fan club. Danielle didn't flinch. Her silence was louder than any insult Karen could have. Karen's smirk twitched. She wasn't winning this fight, and she knew it. The flight attendant returned, her face tight with concern. Ma'am, I've asked you to lower your voice. Karen plastered on a fake smile. Oh, I wasn't being loud. Just having a little conversation. The attendant glanced at Danielle. Her eyes asked the question she wasn't saying out loud. Are you okay? Danielle gave a small nod. She wasn't fragile. She didn't need rescuing. But Karen wasn't done. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. You should be grateful you're even allowed to serve, she muttered under her breath. Danielle finally turned to face her, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. What have you sacrificed for this country? Karen blinked. What? You said I should be grateful, Danielle repeated, her tone even. Tell me, what have you given up for this country? Karen's mouth opened, then closed. I pay my taxes. A snicker came from somewhere in the cabin. Danielle nodded slowly. And I've risked my life so you could keep doing that. Karen's face flushed. For the first time, she had no snarky comeback. The businessman chuckled under his breath. The young woman across the aisle smirked. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her confidence cracking. Danielle turned back toward the window as if nothing had happened. Silence stretched between them. Thick, heavy, uncomfortable. Karen's confidence wavered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She huffed. I'm just saying, I think people like you. Danielle cut her off. You think? Danielle finally spoke, turning back to face her. Have you ever been anywhere near a battlefield? Have you ever heard the sound of a bomb exploding close enough to shake the ground beneath your feet? Karen hesitated. Well, no, but Danielle's voice remained steady. Have you ever held a dying soldier's hand while promising them they'd be okay, knowing they wouldn't make it? Karen swallowed. Danielle didn't blink. Have you ever spent nights in a war zone, wondering if you'd wake up the next morning? Silence. Karen didn't respond. She couldn't. Danielle exhaled, shaking her head. Then maybe you should listen more than you speak. Karen turned away, looking anywhere but at Danielle. Her face burned with embarrassment. The businessman across the aisle smirked. Guess that settles that. A few passengers chuckled under their breath. The plane remained in silence after that. Karen didn't say another word. Danielle closed her eyes, letting the moment pass. But she knew. This conversation wasn't over yet. The cabin was quieter now. Not peaceful, just tense. Karen sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed. Her confidence had cracked, but her pride kept her from backing down. Danielle exhaled slowly. She had nothing to prove. She had said her piece. But Karen wasn't done. She shifted in her seat, glancing around the cabin, searching for allies, finding none. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. Karen took a glass of white wine, swirling it as she smirked, then just loud enough for Danielle to hear. She should be grateful she's even allowed to serve. Danielle's fingers twitched. Not in anger, not even in frustration, just exhaustion. She had heard it before, too many times, in too many places. Danielle turned her head, her gaze steady, her voice calm. What have you sacrificed? Karen blinked. Excuse me? Danielle tilted her head slightly. What have you given up for this country? Karen huffed. I pay my taxes. A man in the row ahead snorted. Someone chuckled softly. Danielle nodded, as if considering. And I've risked my life so you could keep doing that. Karen's face burned red. She looked around again, expecting support. Finding none. Danielle turned back to the window. The conversation should have ended there. But Karen wasn't the type to walk away quietly. She lifted her glass, taking a slow sip. Then, in a tone dripping with forced politeness, so what exactly did you do in the military? Danielle didn't move. Karen continued, because let's be honest, they probably stuck you behind a desk somewhere. Danielle inhaled. She wasn't going to explain herself. Not to Karen, not to anyone. She didn't need to, but the memories surfaced anyway. Gunfire, explosions, the smell of burning metal, the weight of a wounded soldier in her arms, his blood soaking through her uniform. Karen had no idea who she was talking to, but she was about to find out. Danielle turned, locking eyes with her, her voice steady, controlled. I pulled men out of burning wreckage while bullets flew overhead. I held soldiers' hands as they took their last breaths. I carried wounded civilians to safety, knowing I might not make it back myself. Silence. Karen swallowed. Danielle didn't blink. I saved lives, Karen. What have you done? Karen opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time, she had no comeback. A few passengers were watching now. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The young woman across the aisle smirked, shaking her head. Karen shifted, gripping her wineglass tighter. Her confidence was unraveling. But she wasn't done yet. She let out a forced laugh, rolling her eyes. Oh, please, you act like you're the only one who's ever worked hard. A businessman a few rows ahead sighed, rubbing his temples. Ma'am, just stop embarrassing yourself. Karen turned toward him, looking for an argument. But before she could speak, a firm voice cut through the tension. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. The flight attendant had returned, and this time, she wasn't giving a polite request. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Karen's voice had been the only thing filling the space, sharp and relentless. But now a new voice cut through. Firm, unyielding. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. The flight attendant stood at the edge of the row, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Karen. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. I don't see the problem. I was just making conversation. The attendant didn't blink. Passengers have complained. This is your final warning. Karen scoffed. Complained? She glanced around expecting support. Nothing. Passengers deliberately avoided eye contact. Some stared at their screens. Others shifted uncomfortably. No one was on her side. Danielle sat still, composed. She wasn't interested in Karen's humiliation. Only peace. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't done. This is ridiculous, she muttered, rolling her eyes. I can't even have an opinion anymore? The flight attendant exhaled slowly, clearly restraining her frustration. Ma'am, I need you to be respectful to those around you. If you continue, I'll have to escalate this. Karen stiffened. Are you threatening me? The attendant remained calm. I'm giving you a choice. Either lower your voice, or I will report this as a disturbance. Karen stared at her, processing. Danielle knew exactly what was happening. Karen had expected to win, to push until she got the last word. But she had lost control. Karen swallowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wasn't ready to admit defeat, but she knew she had no choice. She huffed, waving a dismissive hand. Fine. Whatever. I'm done talking. The flight attendant nodded. Good. Danielle could feel the shift in the air. The tension wasn't gone, but it had finally broken. The flight attendant turned to Danielle, her voice softer. Are you okay? Danielle met her gaze. A silent moment passed. A question, an understanding. Danielle gave a small nod. I'm fine. The attendant lingered for a moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the aisle. Karen took another sip of her wine, but it was different now. Defensive, small. She had spent the entire flight trying to shrink Danielle, but now Karen was the one who had shrunk. Danielle closed her eyes and leaned back. The battle was over, or so she thought. The morning sun poured through Karen Whitmore's spotless kitchen windows, casting golden light across the marble countertops. She stirred her coffee absently, the silver spoon clinking against porcelain. It was a normal morning. Quiet, predictable, safe. She liked it that way. The television hummed in the background, delivering its usual mix of politics, business updates, and weather reports. Nothing worth her attention. Then a familiar name shattered the routine. Major Danielle Carter, a decorated war hero, is making headlines today. Karen's hand froze. The spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the counter. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Danielle Carter, the woman from the plane. The woman she had mocked, dismissed, belittled, and now she was on every screen in America. The news anchor's voice carried on, steady and reverent. Major Carter served in multiple combat zones, leading medical rescue missions under fire. She was awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary bravery. Karen's breath caught as the screen shifted. Grainy combat footage appeared. Soldiers crouched behind cover, bullets raining down. And in the middle of it, Danielle Carter, dragging an injured soldier to safety, her uniform soaked in blood. She risked her life to save 5 wounded soldiers and a local interpreter. The anchor continued. Despite being shot herself, she refused evacuation until everyone was safe. Karen swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. The screen changed again. A different image now. Danielle standing at a podium, shaking hands with high-ranking officials, a medal glinting on her uniform. Composed, dignified. A woman who had given everything for her country. Karen's stomach twisted. Her own voice echoed in her head. Bet she never even saw real combat. She probably just sat behind a desk. She should be grateful she's even allowed to serve. God, how could she have been so blind? Footsteps echoed behind her. Her husband walked in, stretching as he grabbed his coffee. Morning. Karen barely registered his voice. The news kept going. After retiring from active duty, Major Carter dedicated her life to helping veterans adjust to civilian life. She now works with wounded soldiers, counseling them through PTSD and recovery. A video clip played. Danielle, seated beside an amputee, speaking gently, nodding as he talked. A woman still fighting for those who served. Karen felt something shift inside her. This woman, the one she had ridiculed, was still saving lives. Her husband frowned at the screen. Wait, is that the woman from your flight? Karen didn't answer right away. She just stared, hands tightening around her coffee mug. Her husband turned to her. Karen? She inhaled sharply, then barely above a whisper. I was awful to her. Her husband's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Karen felt heat rise in her face. She didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to admit it, but she had to. She set the mug down carefully, staring at the counter. I assumed things. I judged her. I said things I had no right to say. Silence stretched between them. The news anchor kept talking, but Karen couldn't hear anymore. Her husband sighed, rubbing his chin. Did she ever say anything back? Karen exhaled. She didn't have to. Danielle's silence had been louder than any argument, and now Karen understood why. Danielle Carter would never remember her, but Karen would never forget her. Karen sat at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee. It had gone cold, but she didn't move. The news report kept replaying in her head. Danielle Carter. A woman she had mocked. A woman she had underestimated. A hero. The realization sat heavy in Karen's chest. She had spent the entire flight assuming the worst about Danielle, judging her, dismissing her without a second thought. And yet Danielle had sat there, silent, composed, not once lowering herself to Karen's level. That was what stung the most. Karen's words, the cruel, biting remarks she had thrown so carelessly, they hadn't mattered, because Danielle didn't need to prove anything. Karen swallowed hard, remembering every insult she had muttered on that flight. Bet she never even saw real combat. Probably just a desk job. She should be grateful she's even allowed to serve. She gritted her teeth. God, how could I have been so blind? Her husband walked into the kitchen, stretching. You've been sitting here a while. Karen barely looked up. He glanced at the television, where another news segment had started. Something on your mind? She exhaled slowly. I was wrong. Her husband raised an eyebrow. About what? She hesitated. How could she even begin to explain? But she had to. I sat next to Danielle Carter on my flight. His brows lifted. The soldier from the news? Karen nodded. His expression darkened slightly. And? She swallowed, forcing herself to admit the truth. I treated her horribly. Her husband frowned. What do you mean? Karen looked down at the table. I assumed things. I judged her. I said things I had no right to say. Silence stretched between them. Her husband sighed, rubbing his temples. Did she ever say anything back? Karen shook her head. She didn't have to. That was what made it worse. Danielle hadn't fought back. She had let Karen's words speak for themselves, and now Karen was left with the weight of them. Her husband leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So, what are you going to do about it? The question hit hard, because what could she do? Apologies didn't erase harm, words didn't undo the past, but sitting here drowning in guilt wasn't enough. She had spent so much of her life making snap judgments, speaking before thinking, tearing people down without a second glance. She thought back to Danielle, the way she had sat still, unshaken. Strength didn't always come from fighting. Sometimes it came from knowing when not to. Karen had lost, and she deserved to. But maybe, just maybe, she could do something with that loss. She pushed her coffee away and stood. I need to fix this, she said quietly. Her husband raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan on doing that? Karen didn't know yet, but she had to try. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just thinking about herself. Karen sat at her desk, staring at the blank screen, her stomach twisted. How do you apologize to someone who doesn't even know your name? For hours she had searched. Danielle Carter's name was everywhere. News articles, interviews, military records. Every page she read made the weight in her chest heavier. Danielle wasn't just a soldier. She was a leader, a lifesaver, a woman who had given everything for her country, and Karen had treated her like she was nothing. She clenched her jaw. I have to fix this. But how? Then she found something, a military outreach program where Danielle volunteered. Karen's heart pounded as she clicked the contact page. A simple email box stared back at her. This was her chance. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had never done this before. Never admitted she was wrong like this. She started typing. Major Carter, you don't know me, but I owe you an apology. Karen swallowed hard. Every part of her wanted to delete the message and pretend this never happened. But she kept writing. I sat next to you on a flight recently. I was rude. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I assumed things, terrible things, and I was wrong. Her breath hitched. No excuses. Just the truth. She continued. I saw the news. I saw who you really are, and I felt sick knowing how I treated you. Karen paused. Was that enough? Could an apology even fix what she had done? She bit her lip and added one more thing. I don't expect you to reply. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell you this. I was ignorant, and I am deeply sorry. She stared at the words. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Her finger hovered over the send button. She hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wouldn't erase what happened. But maybe, just maybe it was a start. She clicked. The email disappeared. Karen leaned back in her chair, exhaling. She had done what she could. But one question still lingered. Was it too late? She wasn't sure. But at least this time, she had tried. Karen sat in her living room, staring at the dim glow of her laptop screen. The email was sent. She had done what she could. But why didn't she feel better? Because guilt doesn't disappear overnight. She thought back to that flight, to every moment she had wasted sneering at someone who had done nothing but exist. Danielle Carter had sat there, calm, unshaken, while Karen had torn her down without a second thought. And for what? Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. She had spent years making snap judgments, whispering, scoffing, rolling her eyes at people she didn't even know. And now she had finally seen herself for what she was. Small, petty, ignorant, but self-awareness meant nothing without action. She clicked onto a veterans charity website, one she never would have looked at before. A small donation. It wouldn't fix the past, but it was a start. She closed her laptop and sat back. Would Danielle even read her email? Probably not. But this was never about a reply. It was about changing, becoming better. She looked out the window, watching the city move below her. For the first time in a long time, Karen wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about the people she had ignored, the stories she had never bothered to hear. And that was a lesson she would carry forever.